See that you sign a song go down. I hate to see that you sign a song go down. Lord, it reminds me that for reasons to stay, I've been exiled and confined to this one more point in time. Ain't got one way out, Caesar, and I just can't go on out that door. Ain't got one way out, Caesar, from this cell block on the shore. Waited 10 years for your letter, oh, and all I'm waiting still. If the barbarians don't get me, then the army is surely will.
Welcome everybody, and welcome to JW3 for those of you who are here for the first time. Welcome back to JW3 for those of you who've been here before. I'd like just to start by saying thank you to Bert and Yona, and to Robin for filming, and for Stephanie for joining in with the music. Thank you very, very much. My name is Maureen Kendler, and I will be what they call moderating this evening with great pleasure. And I'm really, really delighted to be hosting such an unusual and special and first-time event. So we extend a very, very warm welcome to Sean O'Brien and also to Yvonne Green. This is the first time that they've read their poems together, so that is another first. And their works are so different, yet what they have in common for when I read their poems is a very strong sense of reflection. They both share a very strong sense of place, intense powers of observation, and tremendous moments of humour. And somehow, in both poets, I understand a need to capture a moment with urgency, or it's going to be lost forever. And thank goodness they both have captured those moments and given so much pleasure to their readers. So just a very brief introduction. Yvonne, who's going to read first, is a poet and translator who describes herself as a Jewess and a Zionist. She was born in England in 1957 to a Berlin-born father and Alexandrian-born mother, and they met through London's Bukharian Jewish community. All four of Yvonne's grandparents were in Bukharia and left in the early 1920s. She studied law at LSE, practiced in the temple till she retired to publish the poems that she'd always been writing. She's a contributor to the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry, and her first collection, Bukharia, was a winner in the poetry business competition, and her forthcoming collection, after Semyon Israelevich Lipkin, was named PBS Translation Choice for Winter 2011. She's a Poetry Book Society Commendation Translator and a Smith Doorstop Prize winner. Her work's been featured in all the major poetry journals, including Haaretz, where she was this year's Holocaust Memorial Day featured poet. Sean O'Brien, slightly older, but only a little bit, born in 1952 in London, is a poet, critic, and a playwright. His collected poems were published in 2012, and he has a new book out this year with what I think is a fantastic title, The Beautiful Librarians. In 2001, he won the Northern Writer of the Year Award, many, many prizes, including the Eric Gregory Award in 1979, Somerset Maugham Award in 1984, Ford Poetry Prize 2001 and 2007, and the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2007. He grew up in Hull, but has lived in Newcastle upon Tyne since 1990, where he's Professor of Creative Writing at Newcastle University. We really are thrilled to have them both. We're going to start with Yvonne and then Sean, and I hope there'll be time for a few questions afterwards. Yvonne, you're going to start, I believe, with What Price Innocence? And if you've got your poetry books, your book sheets, you can find these poems. That seems to me to be a poem about the struggle to express loss and the search for truth. You told me once that Martin Amis said to you, everyone is inarticulate. We all struggle to say what we need to say. You seem to be struggling to capture that inarticulacy and make it articulate in this poem. So what price innocence?
It's also about parents who forbear, I think. Thanks for that lovely introduction. And I want to echo how grateful I am to be here today in such august company. We've got wonderful readers in the audience as well, and some very good writers, Jean Rausch. Just remind me, I'm sorry. Marie, give your surname? Mary Guinea, a few people here who write really wonderful poems too, who I hope will be up here one of these days. Okay, what price innocence? That's what's lost, whispers a mother. How can I protect? Asks an aunt. What replaces it? Says a grandmother. And the fathers, uncles, grandfathers, who can't till the land, man the factories, go to war, wear suits, find formulae, be wise women, or bemused. Secrets, myths unexplained, histories lie quieter for now. There's knowledge and its antithesis, webbed, processed, discussed, fingered, moulded, but the people, children, strangers who have it, have more. They have what's always been innate, curiosity, questions, fear, courage, answers. And they grow older after living in time, informed or able to be.
The next poem is Mother Me Always. This one was commissioned for Mother's Day in 2001 by a church and was read on your behalf by someone as part of the church service for Mothering Sunday. It's commissioned by the poet Neil Phillip and his artist wife Emma Bradford. I believe they don't have children. You do, and I feel that's influenced the writing of this poem somehow.
It seemed very important to me to write a poem about having a mother for them. They're both very good children, although they're in advanced age, but they both continue to be very devoted children, and also very influential in the village of Ilbury, where they convene the poetry festival when there's money to do so. Mother Me Always. A memory full of senses. Your smell, your flesh against my cheek, your glance which checks my action, your voice I overhear as you deal with others, more lightly than you deal with me. Mother Me Always, serious, funny, overwrought, fumbling, certain, prescient, frustrating. Mother me always with your wisdom, expectation and demands, with being, with your having been.
The next poem is Welcome to Britain. This was the theme, Welcome to Britain, of the Buxton Poetry Festival in 2012, and we won a commendation for this poem. And there's certainly some biography in these lines.
Welcome to Britain. My father came here hooked to the side of the Douglas Dakota after Paris was liberated and he left his camp. He came to do war work or volunteer. We were British from Bukhara for generations. We had huge white documents which said so. We traded with the Cottonopolis of Manchester when the American fields burned during the Civil War. We'd interceded for the lives of Connolly and Stoddard, who the Emir had consigned to his snake pits. But we were strangers when we came to where I'd be born, go to grammar school, find language, literatures, history, geography to add to my own.
There seems to be a theme emerging for this evening about parents. So the next poem is The Parents. And this was written in 2004 about your parents, who were then at the ripe old age of 82, so 10 years on. You are now blessed with 92-year-old parents. And they live to 120, but I guess those 10 bonus years have given you a new perspective on what it's like to have really old parents as opposed to just very old parents. So, The Parents.
When you write a poem, there's a funny thing about it, because the minute you've written it, you feel differently about everything in it. But this is a real example. I thought they were really old then, and really naggy, although I adore them. It's being filmed, they're wonderful. And all due respect to parents, I hope I do it. And I visit them often and everything. But the fact is that they're much, much different now to how they were then. I mean, they're really old now. Anyway, The Parents. So I feel really stupid, actually. It's good to have you to stay in your extreme old age, finally all to myself. And you can't go off anywhere, or rather you need me, as you keep wanting to go places. I'm glad to take you. I enjoy listening, watching, keeping you happy. You don't listen to me. Nothing changes there. But you do to the children. Is it our custom that grandparents hear and parents must be deaf? I've lost our language. Our unnamed behaviours persist, bewilder, estrange us from others. I want you to explain it to me, or at least the part you understand. But you smile at familiar meals, and as ever leave my questions half answered.
There's a lot of nodding from the audience. I think we look forward to the one when, please God, there'll be 102, and we'll hear how you feel 10 years on. The next poem is The Magic Carpet, which needs just a little bit of background. You talk about a family working on the Qum, Q-U-M. Qum is, for those who don't know, and that included me when I first found out about this poem, is a silk carpet. It's got the extraordinary statistic of having 1 million knots per square foot. No, I don't know how that can be either, but that's it. And Yvonne, you have one, I believe. Your family came from Bukhara, where you can trace your ancestry back 2,700 years, and there has always been silk in that part of the world. Your great aunt was a poet there, I believe, for the Emir, and this poem, Qum, means, it's written in a special 2-line form called a ghazal, which is the way your great aunt would have written a poem too at the time. Now, I know your background was a business one, and that your family were always traders, so you would have had, your family would have made one of these qums. I think that's the...
They sold it.
Oh, right, they would have sold them. But I think if you have one, I'm really not sure if it's a blessing or a bit of a burden, this great big...
Terrible burden. White elephants. They always give you white elephants, so you have to
So I guess if you have one of these special
Curate.
carpets, you have to keep it somewhere. And it means you have to have the kind of house where you can keep this and look after it. So I think having one implies a certain responsibility, but also a certain way of life. So I was going to say almost a burden, but I'll take the question mark away from the sentence.
It's a burden, but you can fold them and put them in a suitcase because they're so credible.
I wonder how many families have them in suitcases. But anyway, so
A lot, because you can't put them.
the magic
The
carpet.
point was, when my dad gave me this white elephant, I said to him, look, this is terrible, this is child labour, I said. You know, 1 million knots per square foot. He says, you're right, the children do the knots the best. He said, but the whole family would have worked on this. And it was in fact signed by somebody called Mir Mohammadi. And he said, you know, the whole family worked on it, and it was their culture and their way of life and whatever. So I interrogated the proposition. I'm not persuaded, I have to tell you, but this is me putting myself into the shoes of that question. Magic carpet. A whole family worked on the knots for this coon. The children's fingers are the best willows of time. They earn this bread of ours. You'll take them to school. We'll lose them, and machines will do the work. In halls of state, museums, palaces, you'll walk on branches and curlicues, borders and spirals, without understanding the language that hypnotizes you away from your own thoughts. What will you teach our children in exchange? With their pink fingers, will they love anymore? How will they remember what our food was like after hunger made them wait for the day's work? Will they be served in their age? Will anyone learn what's needed for this hardest of jobs? No, they've earned it. Accept the time to travel with them into the fantasies they want to imagine.
Thank you. The next poem is called Honoured, and there's a line repeated in this poem which says Ach Ya Rab, Ach Ya Rab. It's an Arabic word that would have been spoken in Bukhara, and I don't have a single English word that translates, but it's a noise, a kind of sigh. So I don't know if you can imagine a very exhausted world with quite dark, quite bitter Ach Ya Rab.
Actually, sorry to correct you more, Ach Ya Rab is Egyptian Arabic, which is the highest form, and that's how Egyptians sigh. I know this because my mother spent our entire childhood saying Ach Ya Rab. But the position is that I've examined an issue here outside my own experience. I'm quoting reference to the Global Foundation to End Domestic Violence, and it's in the course of that work that this came to me. Honoured. Ach Ya Rab, she says, as she hits her head with stones. Ach Ya Rab, she wails as she slaps her cheeks. As her husband covers her, she feels nothing because she's been bitten away by her grandmother. Ach Ya Rab, she cries as she gives birth to the Shahida. Ach Ya Rab, she says as she feeds her with ecstasy and closes away from the mundane. Ach Ya Rab, as she lays down iron on her girls and honey on her boys. Ach Ya Rab, when her husband hits her, when her mother jumps on her to her feet, when the glance of her mother-in-law falls in the cut which kills her.
It's a very dark poem. It's a very dark poem.
We grew up with very strong rules about honour and behaving the right way and doing honour to parents, but this idea of honour, which would lead to honour killings, was something I felt I had to examine, because it would, and they would say, I'll kill you if you do that, but I don't think anybody meant it, you know.
So there is that violence.
Look, I think that we grew up in a culture where there were very strict and valuable family norms, but not this. Not this. You know, you leave if you don't conform, you just go. And I think it's the same in Mea Sharia, you know, a religious community, people will just leave, they're not going to be killed. Sorry, so next.
Yeah. The Ubul, that's the next one that we're going to hear. The Ubul in Alexandria, circa 1935. And Ubul is an at-home, which I think is an extremely English idea, an at-home. And there's a lot of food in this poem. So I'm just going to do a quick recipe count for you. There is loaves, which is marzipan. There's horavia, ground almonds in pastry. Konafa, which is pistachio, which is in phyllo, kind of shredded wheat, but better than that, I think. And there's halawa, which is an Arabic word for halva. And this is all very sweet. This is a very sweet food at the at-home. And I believe this is about your wonderfully named maternal grandmother, who also has, she was called Rybakov.
Family name.
Family name was Rybakov. Ryba is a Russian word for fish. So I'm assuming someone in Yvonne's family ate fish.
Nobody had surnames, so they had nicknames. So the family's name was Rybakov. So it was somebody in our family, great, who was known to love fish, and mainly Bukharan meat. In fact, the word for a meal is posh, which means meat. So he was obviously a great, strange man. He travelled a lot to, that one travelled a lot to the capital, to Moscow, and in fact to St. Petersburg. He was allowed to because he had some special permission, and so he would have eaten fish and things which they didn't have in Bahrain. He considered himself quite refined. The Ubul in Alexandria, circa 1935. Tuesday was my, this is a prose poem, so Tuesday was my grandmother's day. She would dress and then receive visitors from about 10 o'clock. The living room was full of dishes of nuts, long pale raisins and small cakes, forayeva, as soft as fudge, konafa, drizzled with syrup, baklava, rice paper cakes interleaved with sugar nuts, drenched in rose water. There were jugs of lemonade, clinking with ice, chipped from the huge blocks delivered for 12 piastres to refrigerate our larder. The morning breeze visited as the ladies sat on the white verandas that encircled their apartment, ornamenting the hour with their commentary. Alexandria's croisette lay beneath them as they were offered different delicacies, rosquette, savoury biscuits, finished with white sesame seeds, cheese or spinach in the sun. The café. At lunchtime, a buffet of salads and fish and rice would be laid. Ladies came and went, partook of refreshments, joined groups mid-story, and left at will. English, French, Italian, Arabic, Greek, Bulgarian, Hebrew, Russian, Spanish, Ladino were spoken interchangeably, and anyone, adult or child, who couldn't manage wit in at least 3 languages was Ida's deficient. Interaction and grace were as essential as food. In the evening, the men arrived and drank a whiskey. A buffet, including meat and chicken, would be laid and everyone would help themselves. After the fruits and cakes would come out again with halawa and gloves, lemon tea in glasses and green tea in small china bowls. The men would smoke cigars and the children would long ago have licked their fingers in the kitchen and gone to bed. On other days, my grandmother attended the Ubul at someone else's house and was joined by my grandfather at dusk.
Thank you. The final poem that Yvonne is going to read, before we hand over to Sean, is called The Hendonists. And this is in response to one of Sean's best known beautiful poems, Novembrists. Now Sean, I don't know what poems you're going to read, but I do hope that Novembrists is going to be read. And Yvonne has written this poem in homage to Novembrists. It's called The Hendonists, and it is about what Yvonne wants to be remembered and recorded. And behind it seems a tremendous sense of compulsion, a about what you really want and need to be saved and memorialised. So here we have the Hendonists.
Actually, it's also homage to everyone who's here tonight. Some have visited us there, and that's it really. We came to your shul to hear Alex Clare the other day in Chelsea, and it wasn't that different. I mean, maybe Chelsea, but it wasn't that different. The Hendonists. It's got to be written of us that we were happy. Some in Brampton, some in Alexandra Road. Some with Kosher Kingdom sushi, some fed by a charity gift. Others still cooking their own kugel. Amen. It's got to be written that all the different shuls made a back and forth, that shears furrowed brows, that women hugged big Talmuds, men tucked them under arm, and both stood foot to foot outside, waiting for lifts for 5-minute drives. It's got to be written that the bell never stopped ringing after 9. And some never gave at the door, others always did. Parents, children, housekeepers handed reluctant, embarrassed, generous or indifferent pennies, pounds, fivers to charismatic or coarse schnorrers whose drivers' engines idled as they checked their lists. Business, duty, this small sector of the mechanics of self-help. They've got to be named. Norwood Ravenswood, Jewish Care, Emunah, Witzo, Harif, Kisharon, Camp Simcha, the school boards, Hasmo, Yavna, the Independent, Sinai, Matilda Marks, Yesodia Torah, their graduates' destinations, Yeshiva, Sem, Hachshara, universities, Shidduchs or Machal, unanalogous to Isisian brides or Syrian bullies, jobs, marriage, birth, pedions, brisses, simchat bat, bar mitzvahs, bikur cholims, shivers, Bushy, Waltham Abbey, Hood Lane, Edgeworth, Friday nights, Shabbos lunches, Sudas, Hagim, Shlachmanot, saplings, fancy dress, drunks, lulavs, sukkahs, apples, honey, Alex Shire's beehives, fasts, feasts, flowers, our hakafoted, cleaned, challah-baked, bedikatted, bathed, dechametz, memunat, kaleidoscope must be looked into before it's twisted, turned, worded, wide, worried over. It's got to be written that we were happy day by day, embedded, layered, accustomed, institutionalized, libraried, Shabbosized, idiomed, grammared, minhaged even, as we took the temperature with our elbows, looked at, or were blind to a future we were written out of.
It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Sean O'Brien. And in the booklet that Yvonne put together, she took a quote, disembodied quote, which is always a bit of an unfair thing to do, from the poem Novemberists, and it says, "The rabbi in his kitchen drinking tea alone, or Winifred Ratcliffe, teacher of pianoforte, staring back into a future from which she, like us, has vanished." And before you start, I'm going to have to ask you, who's the rabbi? Is it a rabbi? You do say the rabbi, not a rabbi.
He was a rabbi who lived locally somewhere we live.
Right.
In Hull.
Right. There are rabbis in Hull, there you are.
There's been a very substantial Jewish community in Hull since the 19th century.
Yeah, I know loads of people from Hull, teachers, very nice.
Thank you very much. Sean, I don't know what poems you're going to be
There
reading.
you go.
And
Neither do I.
we're very, very excited to hear them. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me and for the wonderful hospitality and the extremely impressive music, of course.
And the lyrics.
I'm going to start with a poem called Audiology, which arises from a very commonplace phenomenon called middle-aged hearing loss, by which I, like many other people, am afflicted. It first came up as a subject when we were in the car, and I couldn't hear what Jerry was saying. And this led to a certain degree of tension. And after about 7 years, I decided it would be best to get hearing aids. So I did, but I found that I could hear absolutely everything, including things that hadn't happened yet. And on one occasion I was reading at the Cheltenham Festival using a microphone, and I began to pick up Radio Luxembourg, even though they'd ceased broadcasting about 10 years before. So I thought that was probably enough of that for the time being. But I suppose it's a poem about there being too much information. Audiology. I hear an elevator sweating in New Orleans, water folding black on black in tanks deep under Carthage, unfracked oil in Lancashire, and what you're thinking. It's the truth. There goes your silent count to 10, the held breath of forbearance, all the language not yet spoken or unspeakable, the dark side of the page. But this is not about you. I can hear the sea drawn back from Honshu, hookers in the holding pen, and logorrhea in the dreaded quiet coach. The firestorm of random signs on market indices, the bull, the bear, the sound of one hand clapping and the failure of the rains, the crackle of the dried out stars, stars being born, anomalies of either or, the soundtrack of creation in an unrecorded vowel, the latest that might be the last, the leading edge of all that is the case or is not there. The contradictions cover such a range. And I'm told that soon it will be easier to balance out the love cry and the howl, to wear an aid and act by age, to hear the world behind this world, and not to crave amnesia. Like many people at the moment, I've got this strange cross between a cold and flu that doesn't know whether it's started or whether it's finished. So my voice and my breathing are a bit affected by it, for which I apologise. I'm going to read a couple of poems about education. We're actually a pair called Pedagogy, and they're dedicated to my friend and esteemed colleague, the poet Cynthia Fuller, who retired recently. And more than most people, Cynthia had committed herself to the project of adult education, which is now, of course, being eroded day by day. So the first half of this pair is Adult Ed, and it's about this process of the kind of disappearance in many settings of educational possibilities which we once assumed would be with us always. Those dim white corridors that would be damp should their stern chatelaines ever cease to pay attention, where the smells of veg and polish meet, those sights of virtuous curiosity with tea urns and plastic tablecloths and warnings about washing up and folding chairs, with Wordsworth, Mill and Middlemarch, and a caretaker fretting to get to the Legion by 9. How could they be permitted to survive? Or the library sheltering the indigent and mad among the adult categories, poetry, fiction, history. Clearly it became intolerable to any sane assessment, like the names of persons, places, things, the dates, the spellings, and the naive rationale that made them public. What can we have been thinking of, we dead in our sensible shoes, with our fussed over folders and mild unprofitable passions? No? No answer? Well then, moving on. And the second part is the seer, and no prizes for identifying who the poem has in mind. The poem arose from the short, bitter culture war about who actually owns the First World War. An argument I never expected to hear, treating history as a form of property. But then I begin to think, well, you know, if you treat it seriously, you could do a lot with history, economically. The seer. Dear friends, applaud the man's divine aplomb. Today, the seer says the time has come to privatise the Somme and Passchendaele. And if that works, then everything's for sale. The 18th century, keep out. Enclose old wasteful state-run epochs and let those with money imagination set the idle dead to work, lest they forget, for too long coddled by oblivion, which side their stones are buttered on. The grave will cease to be a gravy train, at least for them. Think what we stand to gain, the seer says, for no one ever lost on Nagasaki or the Holocaust. I found myself wondering at one point what a god would do if he decided to retire. You know, a Greek god decided to step down from the pantheon at some unimaginable age and occupy himself with retirements. What would he actually do? But I also wanted to write a poem which had a title which might have been by Wallace Stevens. So this is called Protocols of the Superfluous Immortal. And he's a sea god, this particular god, who's retired. A god, long since retired to the seaside, checks the post and tuts at the barometer. Some dirty weather in the offing, freighters in the channel battened down, the green wave walls remote and terrifying as his youth. He rereads Hornblower in bed. He never sleeps. An egg, please, and the telegraph. His constitutional, the bandstand, out along the pier, the wintry courtesies accorded others of his solitary kind. Then afternoon, no weather worth the name. The day extends towards whatever it extends towards forever, and the god applies himself once more to 13 down. The only word that rhymes with breath. But it's no good. I was very honoured to have the Ovid items put to music, and I have to say they sound a lot more impressive that way. Very moody, in fact. But as many of you will know, the poet Ovid was exiled from Rome by the Emperor Augustus for reasons we don't really know, and he was never allowed to come back. And he spent his latter years in exile writing poems in the hope of regaining favour, which he never did. So he was exiled to Tomis, which is now Constanta, on the Black Sea at the mouth of the Danube. And he used to complain that he'd be walking around the town trying to write poems, and barbarians would be throwing spears in over the walls, and this was not what he had imagined for his golden years. So I thought, well, he's really a blues man ahead of his time in some sense. So this is in two little bits, both of which are modelled on a blues formula. Number one, I hate to see that Euxine sun go down. I hate to see that Euxine sun go down, because, Lord, it reminds me that for reasons of state, I've been exiled and confined to this one-horse Pontic town. 2. Ain't but one way out, Caesar, but I just can't go out the door. Ain't but one way out, Caesar, from this cell block on the shore. Waited 10 years for your letter, oh Lord, I'm waiting still. Barbarians don't get me, then the ennui surely will. Until recently, I had a lot of family connections with Scarborough, the Yorkshire seaside resort. But the part of town where my relatives tended to live was very bare of pubs. In fact, the only one there was the grimmest pub I've ever been in, which is saying something. And in case you have to find yourself in Scarborough, do not go to the Rams Hill Hotel, which should be renamed the Why Don't You Top Yourself Now Arms. But occasionally there was no choice except to go in there, and it was infinitely miserable over a period of 35 years. And then one time we happened in there and something romantic was taking place. There was music and song of a kind. There's these old lads at the Rams Hill Hotel. The old lads left for dead once more arise through the velcroed floor of the family lounge to take their positively final leaves of the hard-faced ladies whose husbands they ignore. Dancing again, like good little Navy-trained bantamweights, the old lads are invoking a higher authority. Leave him, Stan, leave him, by means of Spanish eyes. Delilah never can say goodbye, and they can't, for this is the eternity of love that opens the old lads' mouths like buckets to the skies. Ferocious and backcombed, the cackling ladies are all too aware of this game. You're a good turn, Pet, but you're on too long. Yet even their iron-clad hearts, those cold and lonely, lovely works of art, are still melted half a degree by these wobbly suitors with grease-grey quiffs and suits which are older than they are, by gentlemen willing, more willing than Bacchus, to take them away from all this, as might an oriental potentate, to the scarlet delights of the Yashmak Seraglio, or, to be practical, the car park. And when a gentleman, not like you, Stan, a gentleman is crooning the shadow of your smile when you are gone, will give us mucky dreams and light the dawn. Crooning, while perched on the glowing red tip of a last cigarette, taken uninvited from a husband's open packet, crooning an angel of fag ash and old breath and pea stains. What lady can resist such old school, old world underwear removing charm? No, Stan, don't miss it, not yet. The title poem of the book is The Beautiful Librarians. For some reason this seems rather popular with librarians. When I got interested in poetry and started writing it and reading it intensively at the age of 14, the poetry stock in Hull Central Library was quite something. It was enormous and regularly augmented. It came from all periods and it was a treasure house. I was there a lot. The fact that the library staff were all extremely good looking, I have to admit, was a bonus when I was in there 3 or 4 evenings a week. So this is for them. And a world they seemed then to represent, a kind of enlightenment and emancipation they seemed to be enacting in a quiet way. The beautiful librarians. The beautiful librarians are dead. The fairly recent graduates who sat like Françoise Hardy's shampooed sisters with cardigans across their shoulders on quiet evenings at the issue desk, stamping books and never looking up at where I stood in adoration. Once I glimpsed the staff room where they smoked and, if the novels were correct, would speak of men. I still see the blue minis they would drive back to their flats around the park to Blossom Dairy and red wine left over from a party I would never be a member of. Their rooms looked down on dimming avenues of lime. I shared the geography, but not the world it seemed they were establishing with such unfussy self-possession, nor the novels they were writing secretly that somehow turned to mum's old stuff. Never to even brush in passing, yet nonetheless keep faith with them, the ice queens in their realms of gold. It passes time that passes anyway. Book after book, I kept my word elsewhere, long after they were gone, and all the brilliant stock was sold. I'm going to read a couple of new ones. In fact, can I borrow your copy? Since it's been requested, I'll read Novemberists.
436.
I began to feel...
Page 436.
Thank you. I began to feel a few years ago that certain kinds of enlightenment were perhaps not all that enlightened, and that there is something to be said for the historicity of the past. And I think this is very much in line with your thinking about Hendon and all that went with it. This is really about the habit. I don't think people do this very much anymore, but my parents and I would sometimes just go for a walk on a Sunday evening, just some fresh air for half an hour. It didn't really matter much what the weather was like, or it was pitch dark, just a breath of fresh air. Novemberists. This must be where I came in, gabardined against the fog, but part of it, to take the dark air, strolling on the glistening concrete of a 10-foot when walking at night would be legal, which puts us somewhere in the 1950s, entering the vast and ramifying silence issued by these garages and sheds that no one would think to repair or improve on. I admit this is a version of the public good unthinkable to those not largely dead, to whom a place is only somewhere on the way to the apotheosis of transactions, those who fear the name Novemberists and cannot see the point of it, and in the end will probably decide they must forbid it, those who think that sentences like this should always finish with the number of a helpline, not more walking in the dark. Here, as we take the foggy night, we hunger for it still, and for the shoals of yellow leaves that come to rest beside a fallen fence where we can watch the rabbi in his kitchen drinking tea alone, or Winifred Ratcliffe, teacher of pianoforte, staring back into a future from which she, like us, has vanished. She will make no sign. We are Novemberists, are we not? Reactionary elements combining in the dark to undermine the decent light of trade with futile knowledge of the spirit's appetite for somewhere in between this world and its discarded shadows. O Novemberists! At the year's death, walking to no purpose but to walk among the rutted leaves and dripping hawthorns, in behind the sleeping yards and flooded lawns and air raid shelters piled with mattresses and comics, now I see it is my parents that I walk beside, her headscarf and his muted cigarette, the desultory familiar talk whose virtue lies in its routine, because it so resembles happiness we do not ask for more, but only wish the night could be extended for an hour or a minute, though we know the rules and limitations of November's paradise, and would not think to break them now, when not a bomb has fallen on the city in a decade, and there is more or less enough to eat, and there are books at home. I see the crime of this is modesty. I see we should not universalize a preference for foggy lanes and intermittent lampposts, should not fall into the habit of the law, whose works are everywhere about us, and yet Novemberists do not care to be entirely reasonable now. Come then, fog and drizzle, frost and cigarettes and dank austerity and blessed peace. We merely wish the times, the state, the market and the world and all their miserable implications could be brought to silence for a moment by attending not to our unquantifiable delights, but closely to some business of their own. I think it was the great Irish poet Michael Longley who once said that long periods of experience and observation taught him there was no such thing as a short poetry reading. So you can think of this as a momentary breather from which I retire in order to leap forth again in a second. I'm going to read another new one. It's always odd when a book comes out because it's usually at least a few months after you've finished work on it and you've gone on working in the meantime. So this is a poem called One Way or Another, which I suppose is it's a poem about the memory of love. One way or another. One way or another at this late stage, I must have them all back, those lost afternoons in the hawthorn wood, on the quarry floor, with the scent like piss, like Shalimar, with the attic also where love took place, with the fall of your hair when you'd marked your page, over the pillow and over the grass, with the look on your face when you called my name, as if that word were entirely new, and I answered in kind, and that was enough, it was world without end. Where did we go when the old year died? We eluded ourselves. Where did we hide? Landfill, riverbed, passage of time, somewhere whose name can never be said. Yet, trace the stairs again, from the attic room to the quarry floor, though no such places exist, any more than the rain that fell on your sleeping face, when I covered you up with my coat and saw the rose blush fading on your skin, but not that this was a moment of grace. What business of ours who are gone can it be if the past keeps faith, if the May tree's scent and the rain evoke the lost look on your face when you awoke in the evening wood, in the attic room, as if they amount to the true address where secretly we're living? I think, on the whole, I have nothing to say. I am old and ill, have gone away. What is this, if not more of the same, when the merciless ghosts insist that if I dare listen, I'll hear my name? And another one which is really, I guess, about our not terribly promising general situation at present. It's called There Were. You notice it's written in the past tense. There were. There were implacable vicissitudes and no hot water. There were demons. There were long, in fact, interminable sermons. There were lies and there were merkins on the nudes. There were convictions, of that there were no doubts. There were drunkards lying under drainage spouts. There were omens everywhere you cared to look. The streets were full of unsolved mysteries to which there was a key, or there were keys, and yet the world lay open like a book. There were explosions, then the silence of the void. We could not claim, our joys were unalloyed. Then came the news, things were all up with us, and our response predictably vociferous. Who were the ones we ought to hang, and who to burn? There were no signs that we would ever learn. And I'm going to read, I think, 3 to finish. My friend Alan Brownjohn, who's here this evening, and I were teaching a creative writing course, a residential course, a few years ago at an unnamed location. And I began to feel, and I suspect Alan may have had the same thought, that there is only so much of this you can do before you start to go out of your mind. I wonder if anybody here has ever been on a residential writing course. If you have, if you'd just show of hands. No, well, it's an avenue of pleasure that remains open.
You certainly sold it well.
Yeah, they've made me their global ambassador now. So this is an admiring impersonation of one of Alan's several manners. It's called Residential Brownjohn-esque. It is, of course, a joke. I have encountered people, with not having a sense of humour persuasion. This is, of course, a joke. Residential Brown John-esque. They put you in the Edward Thomas room, the dim one in the annex with the tiny window blocked by leaves, with a sleepless chiff-chaff, and the bed you realise eventually is coffin-shaped. There will be baked potatoes and a sense of déjà vu, lasagna and perhaps a sense of déjà vu. The director is on leave, is leaving, has left, is barricaded in the office with a shotgun and a box of mini cheddars. It all seems very far away, the rurals, like somewhere you're not really meant to go, not liking smells or sheep especially, in Wales almost. Yet after all, what is it? Only a week of your life, one long week of the short third act, in which to have fallen with a sense of déjà vu among demons and maniacs and bores. Reading down the list of names, you seem to know them all from somewhere. Flannery Anaconda, Delphine Stain, Euphemia Bandersnatch, Clive Overbite, and the indomitable Norman Shouty. And someone who is always not there yet, but on a train, a plane, a mission, medication, sectioned, and all the rest. How many of the bastards are there? They are waiting. If the slurry served at dinner seems to have a fringe on top, remember, truth is beauty, beauty truth, and that is all you need to know, so eat your greens. Enough of this, it's time, it's time. There is a further room prepared, the déjà room, down a dark path, through a mire, a grimpen, a minefield, a boneyard, Wales, not far. And there at last you have to talk to them. They're waiting with their pens, their grudges and their daggers eagerly.
It's a very cruel joke.
And penultimately, a poem set in Paris, Café de l'Imprimerie, a sort of collapsed villanelle about waiting. Romance appears to involve, in my experience anyway, a good deal of waiting about, so this is about that. Café de l'Imprimerie. I wait for you inside a glass beside the long dim window of the Café de l'Imprimerie. I see you beautiful and wry and not yet here, and yet not here. While this late summer evening never ends and never ends, but is infinitesimally dimming on the street beside Les Halles, where I can see you, beautiful and wry as you draw near, and I am reassured you are not coming. Yes. All night I wait for you at the Café de l'Imprimerie. Your absence makes you beautiful and wry, and this late summer evening never ends, nor does the beautiful, intolerable music, where the truth is cut with sentiment and surely fatal. Come now, do not come. Come now, do not. And lead me to a room where you undress, a bare white room at an untraceable address, where we will stay forever. Come now, do not. Yes. And I'll finish with well, I don't know, kind of a demented fit of mythologizing called Mutatis Mutandis. This requires a bit of vocal, a bit of roaring, so if I collapse, have them take me away. Mutatis Mutandis. The steersman, I should say, thank you very much for listening, and it's great to have such a nice audience. The steersman is lost, and the hole he has made in the water has swallowed his cry and healed over. The curious fishes must make what they can from his bones, or the great whale may vomit him up on the shore at the feet of a queen who stands waiting and waiting through moon after moon with no news and no rumours, but only her sorrow for company. Maritime cities are burned to the waterline. Plague passes north like an army of phantoms by night, and volcanoes roar out from pole to equator, while the stones of the world break open and swallow each other, and darkness closes over the face of the water, and new seas arise from the wreckage of empires and settle and still. At the third stroke, the time will be nothing at all, the time of undreaming, when rivers and language are locked in the ice, when the eye and the ear have grown weary of seeing and hearing. The play and the music are over, the desert gives way to the desert, and heaven's high quarrels have found a new venue. The gods never speak of us. We must wake into this poisoned sleep and gather our rag and bone birthright about us, and wait until somebody hears herself talking and says it again, and somebody beats on a drum with the bone of an auroch and finds that the rhythm becomes an opinion, and then with the same bone sketches a line in the sand as the blizzards melt back to the poles, and a fire is lit that all men will know of and worship or fear. So many waves of desire, dynasties, fetishes, novel barbarians out of the inexhaustible East. Inquisitors are always on their way, and at one time all this was just fields, where the cemeteries grow from the bones of the infantry, forests of marble in which we may seek after wisdom, pursuing the fugitive spirit of things as it slips through the silent ranks of those King Death conscripted for a host the like of which has not been seen by men or gods, and in whose vanguard, goddess, you and I both ride with fire and sword, because it must be so. The ocean and the mountain and the fire at the core demand it. Why else do we lay siege once more to Troy or Carthage, or whatever this place will be called? Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. It's wonderful. It's fantastic to hear these poems being read. When we read both Yvonne and Sean's poems on the page, they have a beauty and a validity of their own. But to hear them being read aloud, I think has added so much to our enjoyment and experience of them. And I really, really am thrilled to have heard you both. I'm going to use the word perform, and I hope that's okay. Perform your own work so beautifully. Are there any questions? I think we have time for a couple of questions.
Well, be brave, you can ask him.
Don't be shy.
There was one line, mother's own mess or something. I just wondered what it referred to, John. There was one line that I picked up and I just didn't know what it meant.
Could you say it again?
It was something like mother's own mess, or I should have written it down, but I'll have a look. It was about one of the early poems. Just the
Mum's old stuff.
mum's old stuff.
Mum's old stuff.
Oh yes, the
yeah.
books
What was
become,
that
novels become mums or stuff because they grew up, didn't
The
they?
idea is that the
Grew up.
librarians were all quietly writing novels, but when we look forwards 30 or 40 years, there's an idea that these aspirations have perhaps not been fulfilled, and that their children refer to them as, oh yeah, mum's old stuff, you know, when they go through it, you know.
Just like my kids refer to my parents.
Any other questions?
It's not exactly about what you were reading, which was quite amazing, but I was sitting there thinking, shall I read some of these poems to my grandchildren? And I spend a lot of time teaching my grandchildren through poetry. Various topics, I think, can always be approached with poetry. I just wondered whether you recommended anything in particular to read to children. Both you and...
It's interesting. So when I made them, they were all doing the blues. And mine was
with a view to them writing as well. It's because I was reading poetry to them that they've started writing their own poetry. But I'd like to take it further.
I wouldn't necessarily begin with me. You know,
and recognise.
probably My old friend Matthew Sweeney writes poems which children seem to find very interesting and enjoyable, among others. But I remember there was, long retired now, a very brilliant middle school teacher called Jill Peary. He used to teach at a middle school in East Anglia, a small town there, and all her English teaching, she was an English teacher, all her English teaching was done through the medium of poetry. Everything she did, everything the children learned got out of poetry, from imaginative writing to punctuation to how to organise your ideas. And I thought that was very inspiring. I have a feeling that she was viewed with a certain suspicion by her colleagues, but I admired her approach that said, poetry is an intense form of language use which can yield all kinds of benefits. She gave them, I don't know, poems by Elizabeth Jennings, she probably gave them poems by Allen. She certainly would have given them, famous anthology pieces by Walter de la Mare, and ballads as well. And
Sean, I used to force my children to learn poetry by heart from the Flower Fairies. No, it was fine. They liked it. They would learn it. I remember I would take them to see Shakespeare, and I'd taste them. They'd have to learn a speech by heart. And when they went to the play, they would start actually reciting when it got to their bit. And there was fun in it. My daughter there's cringy, but I think there was fun in it, and you're not afraid to try.
Yeah. One thing you encounter quite a bit, you meet people and they often say, when you talk about poetry, often say they were put off it at school, which I think is a catastrophe. But I tend to reply with a story of my own, which was at my junior school. We had one lesson a week which was called poetry, which was obviously something, they hadn't got anything in this slot, so they got this extremely irascible maths teacher and this ancient anthology of poetry to fill up a slot on Friday afternoon. And Mr. Ransom really didn't want to be there any more than we did. And the first session he said, he picked out a poem, I think it was something very brief by Tennyson, and said, "You learn this off by heart. And if I ask somebody when I come back, they don't know, I'll bray them, understand?" So he disappeared for a cigarette or to beat up somebody else. He came back after a bit and said, "You, O'Brien, recite the poem," and I did. I thought, it can be a weapon.
The other thing that we have in our community is our children learn a lot of prayers very young. They learn Grace After Meals, for example. It's all poetry, creative, creative learning. The prayers are all poetry, and I think, and then when they're 13, they have to learn to, what we say, lane from the Torah, which has a scansion, it has notes, it's all poetry, and I think that is a very good preparation. But Kerridge is here, Jonathan Kerridge-Phipps, who's my children's English teacher, so how would you answer? Because you've made them both read poetry.
Yeah, I think you mentioned some really great things. I mean, I was, Ted Hughes is someone I go back to time and time and again, unseen poems at Key Stage 3, I get them when they're quite young. Seamus Heaney, and of course they were famous, I think, for working together, weren't they, to put together anthologies of poems like that, poems that could be read to children at a formative stage of their education, so I always go back to them as a pair.
And the Bosoms was what I started my son on when he wasn't interested in the subject. He came to mind. Which one? Spike Milligan. They've collected all Spike Milligan.
Any other questions? Yes?
I love the title of your book, and you talked about discovering poetry in libraries. Do you think this is a lost art of librarians, and do you see a future for libraries?
Well, I hope not. I mean, I think the library is a great democratic instrument. In theory, all you need to do is go there, take a book down, sit and read it. It's very direct. But when I go to public libraries nowadays, they often seem to be shelved in a way that I don't understand anymore. they're shelved more on the basis of reader preferences than a Dewey Decimal System. That confuses me. I do remember when I was a kid going to a local branch library where we lived, and I was mooching about looking at various things, and an old bloke came in and said to the librarian, "Hello, Pep, you got any worry westerns?" Because what he wanted to read, was Zane Grey and J.T. Henson and Louis L'Amour. And she had to explain to him that these were not shelved separately from all the other fiction. But I think they probably would be now, if anybody still reads westerns.
We have a poetry group every once a month at Hendon, and some of our people here. And there's a cafe there, and there are loads of videos. There's lots of other stuff going on which has nothing to do with library, seems to me. And we have to shut everyone up, don't we, and move all the tables. And people get quite irate that we're actually having a poetry group, but we visit.
I think we may be offending a librarian in the audience.
No, you're not. I
Don't
was
worry, she's
taking-
my friend.
No,
I
I was
think her
taking a
regularly.
group of children to the library. They went for Dewey training. And don't ask, it's just something. And we did. And as the librarian was training them, the first thing she said was, for example, poetry is in section number 700 or whatever it was. And one of the little 6-year-olds who was with me, who doesn't have English, who is a Somalian refugee, said, "But why? Why is poetry with information books when poetry is just stories? It's just creating, it's just telling what we want to say." The librarian didn't have an answer. She says, "No, that's just where we put it." She goes, "But why? I like writing poetry because I don't have to use so many words. And I can just tell my story as I want to tell my story." And this very sweet 6-year-old had a big argument with the librarian about where poetry should go and if it can be made up or not made up.
And you let them, which is the real credit to you. Very good.
You know me.
Yeah.
Of course I do. And I was on the
inspirational.
sidelines going, "Go girl, you are." Yes.
I know, Jonathan, here is a question, but there's just one more library anecdote that might strike a chord, which was about 10 years ago. It was a friend of mine, no longer with us, who had an extremely good jazz band, and I were asked by one of the local libraries in Newcastle to do an event one lunchtime, where I'd read some poems and they'd play some music. And there was an eager audience of about 20 pensioners sitting there. And this was fairly kind of, straight ahead, straight-fingered, serious jazz, it wasn't Vera Lynn, it wasn't Glenn Miller, but they sat there eagerly, Wow, we must be doing something right. And afterwards you realise that the shelves behind where we were playing were the newly returned books were put out. So they were waiting for us to go away. So.
I was delighted to hear what you were doing at Hendon since I grew up there. Good. Spending all the hours on the way home from school.
Good. We'll come to the group.
But-
First Monday of every month.
But I want to tell you that I was deeply disappointed, and nobody seemed to realise how I felt when I took my grandsons in shortly after they'd lost their father, because I wanted to introduce them to the library, because they had their heads in computers too much. And I went in and I said to the librarian, in the children's library, we're looking for poetry books, we're looking for this. And she said, "Oh, go outside and look it up on the computer." And I said, "I didn't come here to use your computer. I want to speak to you. I want you to tell me."
It's all computers there, it's awful, but not when we're there. Except on the
Yeah, I'm just listening there and reconfirm something that I've thought about your work before when I've been reading it. You seem to use an awful lot of collective pronouns when you're writing. There's lots of we and our and us, whereas often speakers of poems in the romantic traditions was I, or often you in more modern poetry, direct address. I was wondering if that's something that you're conscious of at all.
I am, yes, I am. I tend not to use the first person singular very much, possibly more now than at one time. I know it can sound, if you're saying we a lot, you're claiming a kind of authority you may not actually possess by including people in an us that one may not wish to belong to. So I suppose it is a sort of rhetorical device, but for trying to address the way in which individual experiences are also in some sense part of collective experience. I suppose that's what I'm trying to get at. But also the way in which you is now used as, I suppose, a democratic form of one. So I'm interested in that. We have an advantage over novelists, I think, as poets, and it's quite difficult to write a novel in the second person. You decide to invent Poland. You decide to invade Poland. You are taken out of the morning to be shot, and then mysteriously Napoleon spurs you.
There's a book like that by Jane McGinney.
Right.
Right, like Big City.
Is that one of the second person?
Yeah.
Right. I didn't know the tracks.
Any other questions? I'd like to say a huge thank you to everybody, particularly again to Yvonne and Sean. Sean, you wrote of your own work, I hope to write poetry that uses the full keyboard, claiming its full range of method and subject. Do you remember saying that?
Yes.
Well, good, because I really would like to thank you both, if I may include Yvonne in this, for using the full keyboard. Thank you so much. There will be book signing for anybody who would like before we go. Have a safe journey home, and once again, thank you very much indeed.
Well, I think a wonderful evening's entertainment here at JW3. I think it's wonderful that Yvonne is organising this series. I hope for many more evenings such as this to come. I think two really beautifully contrasting voices tonight, two poets from two different worlds, entertaining us very richly, and a real sort of explosion of talent that we can all take a lot of enjoyment from. So, wonderful.
Nice to hear them read and to hear them bring the stories to life and to hear the background and how they came about writing their stories and their poems and what it meant for them and the really personal touch that put the poems into context.
Thanks very much. That was a wonderful evening. It was a real pleasure hearing Sean read and hearing Yvonne read, and their poems I think really came to life off the page with great humour and great fun and great energy, so it was lovely.